Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13. Hello and welcome to episode 19 of It's Murder Up North. Ever since I can remember, I have been afraid of fire. Often waking from nightmares in which I find myself trapped in my bedroom, and the house is ablaze with flames consuming everything around me. Fortunately, I know that I can wake from my nightmare. But for the family in today's episode, that very nightmare became a reality. Before I head to the episode, please check out my podcast of the week. CJ is a wonderful host and friend who has been so supportive since I started my podcast. Here is a sneak peek of her show.
Hey there, it's CJ, host of Beyond the Rainbow, true crime to the LGBT community. Please join me as I hop upon my beautiful unicorn, sprinkle myself with protective fairy dust, and open a closet full of stories just waiting to be told. You can catch the show on almost all podcast apps. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Beyond the Rainbow Pod. Remember, it's not a crime to be gay, unless you're a murderer.
Now, let's head to the episode. For thousands of years, our ancestors relied on fire for warmth, light, and protection. It can invoke romantic notions, flickering candlelit dinners, the memories of cooking marshmallows on a campfire, or cuddling up beside an open fireplace on a cold winter's night. Fire was essential to the survival and evolution of our species, but it is also a powerful force of nature that brings death, destruction and devastation. Just after midnight on the 2nd of December 2008, in a semi-detached house on Norwood Grove in Liverpool, the heat and intensity of a raging fire funneled ferocious flames up the staircase. Thick black smoke found its way into the bedrooms and descended upon the sleeping occupants. Kieran Bimpson woke, struggling to breathe, his eyes stinging amidst the heat and blinded by the smoke, which only intensified his hearing. His ears were deafened by the fire alarm blaring and the crackling roar of the fire beyond the bedroom door. 17-month-old Anne-Marie began to cry in her cot beside her parents' bed, waking Kieran's partner, Eleanor. Through the blackness, Kieran managed to find the door. The panel was hot against his hand as he opened it. Instantly he was accosted by the raging inferno that consumed the hallway, blocking the staircase, trapping Kieran and his family on the first floor of the house. Over the ferocious bellowing of the flames, as they eradicated everything they touched, Kieran could hear the cries of his children. His 14-year-old son, Kieran Jr., who was calling out to his dad, and the screams of his two girls, 3-year-old Francesca and 8-year-old Christina. The blaze blocked him from getting to his terrified children, the searing heat forcing him back into his bedroom, where Eleanor, in a petrified state, clung to Anne-Marie. The little baby's cries weakened by the density of the smoke. In desperation, Kieran made the decision to jump out the bedroom window, plummeting 10 feet to the ground. Pain shot through his ankles as his legs crumpled beneath him. But despite the agony, he raced to the front of the house, his children's screams ringing in his ears like a bell summoning him forth. As he rounded the corner of the house, he noticed a man stood at the end of the footpath. But in that moment, all Kieran was focused on was rescuing his babies. Kieran Jr.'s room sat above the front door. He managed to leap from his bedroom window, but in the adjoining room, the figures of Christina and Francesca could be seen. Their faces pale in the darkness. Christina shouted for her daddy to help as she clung to her little sister's tiny hand. As Kieran tried to reach the girls' bedroom, neighbours had begun to arrive, eager to help. Amongst them was Eleanor's brother Frankie, who without hesitation forced his way through the front door and battled up the burning staircase, his skin blistering from the heat. He was able to reach the master bedroom, where Eleanor was stood by the window with the baby held tightly in her arms. The heat had warped the frame, preventing the window from opening, and Frankie frantically forced the glass to shatter. Eleanor, shaking in terror, handed her baby to her brother, who had no choice but to drop the child from the window and hope that those gathered below could catch her. Anne-Marie was caught by a neighbour and swiftly rushed to the front of the property and away from the burning house. Frankie then guided his sister over the broken glass. As he lowered Eleanor down by her arms, she winced in pain from her stomach being torn by the broken shards. But once safely on the ground, she hurried to the front to discover that her other daughters were still trapped inside the inferno. Frankie did not follow his sister. He heard his nieces crying for help. Knowing they were still trapped, he was unwavering in his desire to help them. But no matter how hard he tried, he simply could not reach the girls and was forced to flee back into the rear bedroom and jump to safety. At the front of the house, Kieran Sr. clambered onto the sloping roof of the living room window, which jutted out beneath the girls' bedroom. He called for 8-year-old Christina to pass him Francesca, but the terrified girl was not strong enough to lift her 3-year-old sister onto the window ledge. Onlookers gasped in horror as the girls' room began to glow orange from the flames beating against the door. Kieran told Christina to climb into his arms. Reluctantly, the 8-year-old kissed her sister and let go of Francesca's hand, then climbed out onto the windowsill. Her dad caught her as she jumped, but the slope of the roof made him lose his footing and he slipped, landing hard on his feet. Instantly he was struck by agonizing pain as he felt the bones in both his ankles snap. Driven by adrenaline, he tried to stand, but his feet gave way beneath him. Helplessly, the father cried out to his 3-year-old daughter, Francesca. He could see her small frame against the increasingly orange glow. He blinked, and she was gone. The emergency services arrived. Fire crews, the police, and an ambulance. The paramedics attended to those who were injured. The police moved the crowd of onlookers away from the house, and the fire brigade had entered the family home. With the knowledge that a 3-year-old child was still inside, they headed to Francesca's room. Eleanor's brother Frankie wanted to get to his niece and had made numerous attempts to help her, but each time he was beaten back by the flames. Even after the arrival of the fire brigade, Frankie was still determined to risk his life to save the toddler, forcing the police to restrain him for his own well-being. It felt like the firefighters had been in the home for hours, but in reality it took them a couple of minutes to reach Francesca. The little 3-year-old girl was lying unresponsive on her bed, with her duvet pulled tightly over her head. An action children do when they are hiding from something scary, like the monster in the closet. But for Francesca, her monster was real, and her duvet was little protection from its rage. Her tiny, motionless body was carried from the house. She was laid on the cold ground while the paramedics tried desperately to save her. The small, fragile toddler was placed in the ambulance and taken to Alderhay Children's Hospital. She was still alive, still fighting, despite her petite frame sustaining 86% burns. Her family also needed medical attention. Her sisters, Christina and Anne-Marie, along with their brother, were treated for the effects of smoke inhalation. which prevents the lungs from receiving enough oxygen, and can manifest with symptoms including a cough, shortness of breath, headache, changes in mood, and reduced cognitive ability. The number one cause of deaths related to fires is from smoke inhalation, when the victim succumbs to asphyxiation. Thankfully, the siblings slowly recovered from their exposure to the toxins in their bodies. Their parents, Eleanor and Kieran, also suffered from breathing in the noxious smoke. Eleanor required stitches for the abdominal wound she had suffered when she was lowered out of the window, and Kieran Sr. had broken both his ankles in the fall. He spent several weeks in plaster casts. 3-year-old Francesca's injuries were extensive. Due to children's skin being much thinner than adults, her burns were much worse than if they had been the same injuries that had affected an adult. Young children are also at a greater risk of further complications, such as hypothermia. However, their youth makes them incredibly adaptable, and their little bodies can recover from injuries that most adults would not survive. The doctors fought to save Francesca, despite the prognosis being bleak. There was a chance she could survive the fire, especially with her loving parents at her side, urging her to pull through. The little girl was a fighter. Not only had she endured the horrific fire, she had to undergo numerous surgeries. Her tiny toes, on which she loved to twirl like a ballerina, had to be amputated, along with her tiny fingers and her ears, into which her parents had sung and talked to her as she lingered in a coma. She was given multiple skin grafts, her eyelids had to be reconstructed. The little girl was fighting for her life. Wrapped in bandages, connected to tubes, and the constant beeping and wheezing of the multitude of machines. It was a devastating sight for her family, but they clung to the hope that their gorgeous girl would pull through. As Francesca Bimpson remained in intensive care, and her family recovered from the effects of the blaze and the injuries that they had sustained, the police set to work investigating the cause of the fire. The investigation was led by Senior Investigating Officer Steve Naylor, who, as he stepped through the burnt-out doorway of the Bimpson family home, was greeted by the characteristic odour of petrol. The provisional tour of the house showed a discrepancy between the upstairs and downstairs of the property. The first floor had been gutted by the fire, while downstairs appeared relatively untouched. In the living room, which stood adjacent to the staircase, everything was coated in soot, but nothing was burned. In the corner of the room stood the family's Christmas tree. Francesca's dad had told the police that they had bought the tree on the day of the fire. He recalled how excited Francesca was. It was the first time she truly understood the magic of Christmas and was excited about the presents and a visit from Santa Claus. Her dad had mentioned that the children had been dancing and singing as they decorated the tree. The whole family was filled with the joys of the festive season, and an exhausted Francesca had fallen asleep on the sofa and was carried to bed by her big brother Kieran. It had been a wonderful evening filled with laughter and joy. On the 23rd of December, that happiness was shattered when Francesca lost her fight. She died, cradled by her parents, just 2 days before the most magical day of the year. Post-mortem revealed that despite her struggle to survive, her lungs and other vital organs had sustained irreparable damage. The investigation into the fire uncovered a number of clues. The front door was charred equally on both sides, and on the threshold a clear pattern could be seen on the floor, which suggested something had been poured in that area. These clues, combined with the smell of fuel, led the investigators to the conclusion that the fire had been caused by an arsonist, pouring petrol through the letterbox. The intense heat of the petrol-fueled blaze forced the flames up the stairs, racing along the ceiling with the extreme heat scorching everything in its path. This explained why the downstairs of the home was barely touched by the fire, as all the energy of the blaze had been concentrated on the upstairs, where the family had been sleeping. The destructive nature of the fire was clear to see. The plaster had fallen off the walls, and belongings that had been stored in the loft had crashed down onto the floor as the ceiling was consumed by flames. Francesca and Christina had shared a bed, and in their room signs of the destructive force of the heat and flames were visible. The flames had shot across the ceiling and then descended slowly to where the little girl trembled helplessly under her duvet. It was a poignant scene for the investigators, especially knowing that the fire had been started on purpose. Who would have wanted to hurt this family? What dark secrets did this family hide that made them a target? Looking into the family's history, they uncovered nothing to indicate why someone would wish to hurt them. Eleanor and Kieran both came from large families. Eleanor had 4 brothers and 2 sisters, while Kieran had 5 brothers. The couple met in a Liverpool nightclub in 1990, and despite a shaky start with Eleanor rejecting Kieran's advances when he first met her, the following week she succumbed to the charms of the champion kickboxer. 4 years into their relationship, they welcomed Kieran, followed by Christina and then Francesca, who was born on the 11th of April 2005, weighing just 5 pounds. She was doted on by her older siblings, and home videos taken on their mobile phones captured the bubbly little girl who loved to dance and sing. The couple and their children were blessed with having a large extended family, and gatherings were a regular occurrence, especially with Eleanor's sisters, Linda and Tina. Linda was in her 40s, and after 20 years of marriage, and her children now adults, she was recently divorced. She had started a short relationship which had fizzled out. Then one day she met a man in the local supermarket. He was a 40-year-old pub fitter called Graham Heaps, who lived with his mum on Conway Drive, just a couple of minutes' walk away from the Bimpsons' home. The couple went for drinks at the local pub and would spend time at Kieran and Eleanor's house. While the investigation into the fire was progressing, Graham was in a hospital, having suffered severe burns. He had tried to assist in the rescue that night and had been found lying on the lawn at the front of the house, his body engulfed in flames. 2 weeks after the fire, he was well enough to answer questions. Police hoped that he had seen something that could help identify the arsonist. He was questioned at the police station regarding his movements that night. Graham stated that after leaving work on Monday, the 1st of December, he had headed to the local pub for a couple of pints. He then proceeded to an off-licence where he purchased some more alcohol before heading home. He spent most of the evening watching television with his mum, and when she went to bed, he decided to head out to get something to eat. He left his house and headed in the direction of Shield Road. In doing so, he crossed the entrance to the cul-de-sac where the Bimpsons lived. When he reached Shield Road, a wide, tree-lined thoroughfare which was often frequented by sex workers, he admitted that he was propositioned by one of them, but he declined. He proceeded to tell police that he was a good client to the women who worked in the area and had been using their services for 27 years. As he neared the takeaway, he encountered a group of lads hanging around near the local park. He openly confessed he purchased £5 worth of cannabis from them. At the takeaway, he ordered his usual burger, a quarter pounder with cheese, onions, tomatoes and chilli sauce, which he then ate as he walked home. He told police that as he neared Norwood Grove, he heard Eleanor screaming and raced to the scene. Without a second thought, he pulled his hood up to protect his head and tried to get into the house, but he had to flee when his clothing caught fire. His brave actions had been witnessed by Kieran Jr., But sadly, Graham could not provide police with any fresh leads. He had not encountered anybody else that night, nor had he seen anything suspicious, and the police were left seeking new leads.
I just want to appeal for anyone to come forward to give any information regarding the death of our daughter. The family is absolutely devastated, as you can all imagine. And on the night that it happened, we were looking forward to having a lovely Christmas, which Francesca, being only 3, she was really excited about, and looking through catalogues. And we just been to the Asda to buy a Christmas tree, which we put up in the living room, and she was dancing around and saying, I want this, I want that, out the catalogue, which, you know, all 3-year-olds do. It was just a lovely night. It was just so exciting, looking forward to Christmas. I was even excited myself, as you do when you put your Christmas tree up. You know, you're thinking about what your kids' faces are going to be like on Christmas Day, and unfortunately, someone's robbed us of that. All I can say is they're an absolute coward, and I really hope out there, you know, people out there will come forward, because they've ripped us apart as a family. And she's looking forward to starting nursery. She should have started on Monday. We appeal, anyone, please, if there's a pang of conscience in anybody out there, someone must know something. And we just need people to start talking, because it's not the actions of a normal person what's happened. They've tried to kill all of us in bed. The safest place is when you go to bed at night. And for us, that night nearly cost us all of our lives.
The Bimpson family did not celebrate Christmas in 2008, nor did they welcome in the new year. In January 2009, they laid Francesca to rest, her coffin carried in a white horse-drawn carriage, fit for a princess. And from the sky, snow fell softly upon the mourners. During the service, Kieran Sr. addressed those gathered.
I'll lend you for a little time, a child of mine, he said, for you to love the while she lives and mourn for while she's dead. She may be 6 or 7, or maybe 2 or 3, but will you, till I call her back, take care of her for me? She'll bring her charms to gladden you, and should her stay be brief, you'll have her lovely memories, a solace for your grief. I cannot promise she will stay, since all from earth return, but there are lessons taught down there, I want this child to learn.
Following Francesca's funeral, police were no closer to catching the person responsible for her death. They appealed to the public via a press conference.
This is an appeal for people to come forward with information about a deliberate fire started at the family home in Norwood Grove on the 2nd of December 2008. And it's things like picking Francesca up from nursery and going to the park with her and chasing squirrels with her, and you know, it would have been the first Christmas that she would have been aware of, and someone's robbed us of that opportunity to see that. And you know, her other little sister Anne-Marie just started walking, and she's missed that happening. We all loved her, and she was the light of our lives. Not only has this offence affected the family, but it's affected everyone around us and everyone who knew her. But to finalise it, I'd just like to thank everyone who's helped us throughout this traumatic time.
Somebody out there knows who is responsible for this offence. Somebody must know this individual or individuals that are responsible. Somebody could hold the key to this investigation. Anybody who may have seen an individual carrying a petrol can around that location, which at the time may not have seemed suspicious. Anyone who's seen such activity that night, please get in touch.
Police suspected that the attacker had to be someone who knew the family and knew where their house was, as its location, tucked away in the corner of Norwood Grove, which was a cul-de-sac, did not make it easy to stumble upon. Reviewing statements from witnesses and checking alibis, a new picture began to emerge. In his interview to police, Kieran Bimpson had stated that as he ran to the front of the house, he saw a man at the end of the footpath. At the time, his concern was rescuing his family, but he recalled that this man appeared burnt, and his face was black with soot. Kieran was able to identify this man as Graham Heaps. This made police probe deeper into Graham's story, and as quickly as he had spun it, the investigators were able to unpick his version of events, starting with his half-an-hour walk to the takeaway. Firstly, none of the sex workers recalled approaching Graham that night. CCTV footage recovered along the route did not capture any images of Graham, and the takeaway owner was able to provide proof that he did not produce an order matching Graham's so-called usual. But it was a statement by his own mother that was the most incriminating. She remembered eating tea with her son that night, and was able to tell police that Graham didn't leave the house until about 5 to 12. She distinctly remembered the time, as the programme she was watching had almost finished. Graham Heaps had not been on a half-an-hour walk to the takeaway. He had left his house just 5 minutes before the fire was started, and he was witnessed by Kieran Sr. already on scene before any of the direct neighbours had arrived.
Got back to the bottom of the road where I turned to walk into my street. Heard Ellen screaming Francesca, shot into the post. Graham's coming out of his door. I ran into the house.
During interview, Graham's claims that he had heard Eleanor calling Francesca's name as he walked past the end of the cul-de-sac did not match with the timeline. He was standing outside the Bimpsons' home before Eleanor had been rescued from the fire, and at no point did any other witness hear the distraught mother call her daughter's name until the little girl was carried from the house by her rescuers. Something just didn't add up. Why did he lie about the trip to the takeaway? Why did he state he was alerted to the fire by Eleanor's screams, when he was already on the scene at the time? What was the reason for his deceitfulness, when he was witnessed trying to enter the property to assist in the rescue efforts? Was it possible he had suffered some sort of trauma which had affected his memory? Or had he started the fire? The police analysed his clothing and found no trace of any accelerant. Graham had a criminal record, but for petty theft, he did not have any history of violence, nor did he display the traits of an arsonist. Unable to connect Graham to the crime, the prime suspect was released, but investigators still sought to prove whether or not he was the perpetrator. Upon his release, there was distinct unrest in the community. Graham Heaps had already been judged and found guilty by the court of public opinion, and out of fear for his safety, which was echoed by Kieran Bimpson, Graham Heaps was relocated to a safe house in Wales. Police renewed their appeal to the public. The main issue the investigators had was that any trace of petrol on Graham's clothing had been destroyed by the fire. However, they were about to get a break in the case. A chemical analysis company had seen the latest appeal and offered investigators their assistance. They stated they had technology which was able to identify the additives found in petrol, which are not easily destroyed by fire. The company also claimed that these additives were unique to a specific brand. Therefore, they could pinpoint where the fuel had come from and whether it matched any other samples taken as evidence. Using state-of-the-art technology, the company were able to identify areas on the front of Graham's trousers and shoes that indicated that his clothing had been splashed by petrol. The additives found on Graham's clothing matched those found inside a burning petrol can that had been found at the scene. This petrol can was missing its nozzle, which was a key feature, as without this the arsonist would have been unable to control the fuel as it was poured through the letterbox, causing it to splash uncontrollably down the front of the door and over Graham's garments. Pictures taken at the hospital showed that his burns and the splash patterns were found to be in corresponding locations. The missing nozzle also meant that invisible vapours were able to escape from the can as the fuel was poured, and in the couple of minutes it would have taken for the attacker to pour the entire 5 litres of fuel inside the container. These vapours would have reached dangerous levels, which meant that, as the match was struck to light the fire, it would have caused a violent explosion, which would have flung the petrol can and anyone holding it backwards, causing them to receive burns with a distinctive pattern. These burns were not as severe as those Graham suffered to his arms and legs, where the fuel on his clothing had ignited. These were consistent with flash burns, usually caused by a sudden burst of heat. Experts were able to identify the direction of the explosion by mapping where the burns were found. In Graham's case, it was apparent that the blast had originated roughly from the height of the letterbox, and as the burst of heat struck his face, it did so in an upwards trajectory, leaving burn marks on his neck, chin, and eyebrows. Yet other areas of his face were untouched, such as the bridge of his nose, which had been shielded by the contours of his face. Investigators now had a clear idea of Graham Heap's involvement. They theorised that Graham had arrived at the Bimpsons' home shortly after midnight. He had emptied the contents of the petrol can through the letterbox, getting fuel on his clothing in the process. When he lit the match, it caused an explosion which forced Graham backwards, and the petrol can flew through the air like a fireball, which had been witnessed by the neighbours. Covered in burns and soot, Graham got to his feet, at roughly the same time as Kieran Bimpson rushed round to the front of the house and began his desperate attempt to save his children. When Eleanor's brother Frankie arrived and tried to get into the property, Graham realised he needed to cover up his injuries, and he too raced into the house, as witnessed by 14-year-old Kieran Jr. His heroic pretence had been shattered by the police, who travelled to Wales to arrest Graham Heap for the murder of Francesca Bimpson. When confronted with the evidence against him, he refused to comment, but police had enough to prove he was responsible for the horrendous crime, and in June 2009 he was brought to trial. During the trial, the jury had to face heartbreaking testimony of the events that night, including recorded police interviews of Francesca's brother, Kieran, who described how he tried desperately to save his little sister. He told police he was unable to move through the thick smoke. It filled his lungs and he struggled to catch his breath. As he returned to his bedroom, he took a deep breath of air from his window and then headed back to Francesca's room. He found that the smoke and flames were too intense. He realised he couldn't reach his little sister, and he was forced back into his own room and had to jump from the window. The physical evidence was proof that Graham Heaps had been responsible for starting the fire, and the jury was shown images of the once joy-filled family home now gutted by the flames. These images had poignant reminders of the life that had been lost, from the Christmas tree in the living room to Francesca's playhouse and white bike with pink wheels in the garden. The prosecution presented a possible motive for the murder, which revolved around the breakdown of Graham's relationship with Eleanor's sister Linda. It transpired that Linda had ended the relationship and had started seeing an ex-boyfriend. The prosecution argued that the defendant had carried out the attack in revenge. Evidence was produced that showed that Graham did not take the rejection well. He began pestering Linda. At one point, he saw her walking down the street. She was talking on the phone when he raced over and snatched the phone from her hand. Ripping open the case, he removed the SIM card before throwing the floor to the ground and smashing it under his feet. Shortly after this, friends and family began to receive bizarre and disturbing messages from Linda's number. Eleanor seemed to be getting the majority of the messages, and she was asked to provide descriptions of the communication she had received via text and voicemail. As she stood in the dock, the grieving mum could not control her emotions. She turned to the High Court judge and said, quote, "I don't know how he can just sit there. Can I just ask him why? She didn't do anything to him. My baby was burned." For 3 weeks she suffered. As the judge asked Eleanor to compose herself, she turned towards the dock where Heaps was sitting, saying, quote, "Graham, look at me. I had to see my baby suffer for 3 weeks. She was in hell. She was tortured. Due to this outburst, a break was called to allow the grieving mother to regain her composure. After a 30-minute recess, the court was reconvened, and Eleanor stood and apologised for the disruption. It was not the only interruption to proceedings. In the emotionally charged courtroom, Eleanor's brother Stephen had to be removed for disrupting proceedings. All the while, the accused remained calm and emotionless. Linda testified that Graham could not accept that she was in a new relationship, and described how he had held her by her throat on one occasion following the breakup, and threatened to kill her if she was with someone else. A former partner of Graham's provided testimony against him. She painted a very different picture to the one Graham had presented to the outside world. Like Linda, she too learned that her former lover could not handle their breakup. He began to stalk her, waiting outside her work and sending her hundreds of text messages. He even sent a video of himself performing an explicit act, which she promptly reported to the police. Graham became jealous when his former girlfriend entered a new relationship, and his behaviour became increasingly threatening, including turning up at her new partner's house. Then suddenly all his correspondence stopped. The most disturbing testimony came from a relative of Linda's, a man called Lee, who, after a dispute with Graham about money, Lee received a sinister text message, threatening to burn Lee and his family in their beds if he didn't pay Graham his money. Prosecutors argued that this showed Graham Heaps to be a jealous and controlling individual, who decided to get revenge on Linda and her family by carrying out the arson attack. But why the Bimpsons? Why did he choose to attack a family with 4 young children? Part of me wonders whether it was just because of where they lived. It would take a couple of minutes to reach their home. They were a convenient choice. He wanted to hurt Linda and did so in the most horrific manner. The jury at Liverpool Crown Court took 3.5 hours to find 44-year-old Graham Heaps guilty of murdering 3-year-old Francesca Bimpson. As Heaps was led away by 3 security guards to await sentencing, a distraught Eleanor shouted, quote, "That's wiped the smirk off your face, hasn't it? You're horrible." Graham Heaps did not react to her cries. He just walked out of the courtroom, cold and emotionless. The family provided victim impact statements prior to sentencing. Francesca's dad spoke of how he is haunted by the pain and suffering inflicted on his daughter. He said, quote, "The endless flashbacks and helplessness, emotional and physical pain and suffering was almost too much to bear. I endure endless nightmares and flashbacks of the night our angel was murdered. We went to sleep on a December night looking forward to Christmas, and awoke in hell." Eleanor addressed the court, describing her beautiful, intelligent, life-loving daughter and the pain she endured from her injuries before she died. Quote, "This horrific crime has took out my heart and ripped it to pieces. Every day she died over and over again, going through torture and hell for 3 whole weeks." Upon sentencing Graham Heaps to 28 years, Mr. Justice Henricks stated, quote, "Your shocking, wicked act of setting fire to a family home with 4 children sleeping in their beds was, in my judgment, motivated by sheer spite. It was a vengeful and cowardly attack on a family of 6 in their own home. They are a loving, close unit who did not deserve to be cursed by your unwelcome attention. You acquired petrol, walked the distance between your home and theirs. You entered the close and must have seen Christmas decorations in the front window of the house. You knew the Bimpson family. You had been a guest in their home. You had met all their children. You knew they had a babe in arms and a child of 3. You knew her name, Francesca. Your intent, I believe, to burn, that is to kill this whole family in their beds as they slept. Graham Heap's actions on that December night defy explanation. His anger manifested in a fire that destroyed a family. Was he so consumed by jealousy that he did not think of the consequences? What was he feeling as he stood before the house, petrol can in hand? Or did he not feel anything as he passed the children's toys lying in the garden? Following the fire, Kieran, Eleanor, and their 3 surviving children lost everything. All their possessions, their home, precious memories of Francesca, and the magic of Christmas now filled with unbearable sadness. Eleanor's brother Frankie was awarded a medal for his bravery that night. He adored his nieces and nephews, and was willing to risk his own life to save theirs. Sadly, the loss of Francesca caused an irreparable rift between Kieran and Eleanor, combined with the pressure of losing everything they worked so hard for. It put too much strain on their relationship, and they have now parted. The heartbreaking and senseless death of a 3-year-old girl who had her whole life ahead of her is devastating. But like a phoenix from the fire, hope has arisen. Her dad, Kieran, has taken his sorrow and used it to help others, those who have suffered because of someone else's actions. He established the Francesca Bimpson Foundation, which is described as a one-stop shop of support for all victims of serious crime. It offers rehabilitation, support, advice, guidance and counselling. If you want to learn more about the foundation, please visit www.francescabimpsonfoundation.org. I will also provide a link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to episode 19. Covering cases involving children is never easy. This case in particular was difficult due to the age of the victim. She was just 3 years old. My little girl is the same age. I cannot imagine the pain that Francesca's parents felt, losing their child in such a horrific way. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Twitter or Facebook. Episode 20 is available on Sunday. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.